Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everybody. We're going to start on time, and I see that Timmons is connected despite it being extremely early for him. Thank you for joining us. Another early morning Zoom call.
Of course, for you. It's not that early for me.
I know it's not that early for you because I am going to read your biography. So first I'm going to introduce the talk series. So welcome to this 13th Climate seminar of our third seminar series. So we're already been going for quite a while. We have two talks by two great speakers who are going to share different aspects of the climate story that I'm really interested to hear more about. And all of our talks are recorded and can then be found on YouTube. And I think Shamili is going to share the link in the chat. We are very, very lucky to have with us Professor Timmons Roberts and Professor Emily Boyd. So I'll give Timmons' biography first, and we'll go into his presentation. And then we will see if he can screen share with us, which will be always exciting. Okay, so Timmons Roberts is the Ittleson Professor of Environmental Studies, Ittleson Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology at Brown University. He's the Executive Director of the Climate Social Science Network. And his current research focuses on social drivers of action and inaction on climate change. After 15 years of studying tensions between the global north and south at the United Nations climate negotiations, he has extended his research into what explains the failure to address climate change in the United States. And his current talk is going to be about all of these things. It is entitled Climate Justice, Global Capitalism, Climate Finance. So everything minus the kitchen sink, possibly. And I should also say that Timmons is one of my oldest colleagues in this domain and a really good friend. And without him, I would not have a career at all. So it is a real joy to be with you today. So.
Thank you, Julia. I'm kind of always shocked by that last statement. That is, I always knew you were gonna be a star. So I'm thrilled. And I'm really happy to be here. And I'm happy to see all the exciting things you've done. Very pleased to be here. Thank you, Shamili and Julia, for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to hearing Emily as well. You're going to have to cut me off because I have too much to say.
Yeah, you're going to be cut off at 20 past.
All right, I'm setting my timer here.
17 minutes. I'll give you a 3-minute warning.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about climate justice, global capitalism, and climate finance. And then I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about how I believe that we've been quite naive. And when I say we, I mean we who are eager to act responsibly as a society to address climate change at the rate and at the scale that the science tells us is needed. And so I'm going to get a little bit beyond this old topic of mine, which I've been working on for quite a long time, of climate justice and especially climate finance. I start here with this picture from 2008 and Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, which is an event that still haunts me. 146,000 people died. And you can see they had no warning. They had no shelters. They had nowhere to go. And they were sheltering literally on the roads from a cyclone. So my big question today is, what's the relationship between climate justice, global capitalism, and climate finance? I'm going to not do it justice because of the time, but here's where I want to go. Talk about some of the elements of climate justice, talk a little bit about climate finance in the UN negotiations. I mean, there's quite a history there. And it's, to me, a history of tension between the global north and the global south, and the lack of trust that comes from promises that are not kept. And then talk about whether climate finance means something potentially that's transformative, both for those global south societies and then for the sort of north-south relationships. And then I'll talk about some solutions very quickly, because Shamili said, you must talk about solutions. So I don't know, we'll see how that goes, but I want to get beyond my usual here's the problem. So climate justice, of course, has many dimensions, and some people actually describe more than these, but these are the three that I usually talk about. That is distributional. That is, some people in the world are getting the goods, that is, the goods that have come from fossil fuels and other land use and so on, emissions over our history. And some people have gotten the bads, that is, more of the bads, that is climate impacts, sea level rise, and vulnerability. And I'm sure Emily will probably take us to some of those. And then another type of climate justice that you could talk about is procedural, that is, how are important decisions made, and the recognition who's considered legitimate for a seat at the table. I focus mostly on distributional sides of climate justice, just because that's my mind, and I'm a sociologist. So even on just that one element, there's a lot of elements, other sub-elements of distributional justice. International, that is, some countries suffering much more or benefiting more. There's intranational, unequal outcomes for social classes and many other categories like race, ethnicity, gender, disabilities, age, and so on. And intergenerational. And I would say, I don't even need to explain that, right? That we are spending our children's ability to have a livable planet. I'm going to focus on the international relations, that there can be pledges and actions at many other levels. That is, our universities, our towns, etc., can make pledges and can take climate actions, and those are extremely important. They're just kind of a topic that's too big for one talk here. And I also think that nations are the only units that can really make binding agreements that cover the scale of the problem, that is, the global level. So that's why I've spent a lot of time looking at the United Nations and started going to the negotiations 20 years ago. So just even on that international climate justice, there are, of course, different elements. And much of the negotiations have focused on mitigation or reducing emissions and who's going to do the work of reducing those emissions. There's of course, it took about a decade for adaptation to get on the agenda, and I'm sure Emily is going to talk about that, or I'm guessing. And that is the ability to prepare for, cope with, and recover from climate impacts. And then there's this new third pillar of climate negotiations, which is loss and damage. That is, when you can't adapt, you have loss of livelihoods or place, cultures, and so on. And all three of those, in my opinion, require climate finance. I mean, I won't say that climate finance is enough. I, of course, believe that we need real binding commitments and accountability on those. But climate finance has come up on all three of these elements, and it's been one of the things that the developing countries or the global South have called for. So climate finance, I walked into a negotiating room of the Least Developed Countries Fund in 2003 and have been fascinated by the tensions that climate finance raise. So the questions that we talk about in a quite new article called The Unequal Geographies of Climate Finance, and trying to use a world systems theory approach to see if we can understand these geographies. Is it redistribution? Is it addressed to the most vulnerable? Does it represent an opening for developing nations to influence, to exert influence in this capitalist system and the political system, the international relations system, geopolitics, or do patterns suggest it's just supporting old inequalities? So you can, if you're interested in that topic, I'll be getting to some of that if I have time. So just in very big strokes, there's massive inequality in who's suffering from climate change impacts. So this is an analysis we did in 2013. Dave Siplett, my now PhD professor at University of Colorado, former PhD student, we looked at the least developed countries, and I'll have a map of them on the next slide. 48, now 46 countries in the poorest parts of the world. They're 5 times more likely to die from climate-related disasters than the global average. So we have the percent of the global population, they're about 11%. They experience 21% of the disasters. So it's not just the existence of typhoons or something, but rather it's a lot of the social vulnerability. So here's the list of countries. This is a little bit old. Some countries are starting to graduate, just 2. And then here's their responsibility for actual historical responsibility for climate change, 0.4%. So there's inequality in both contributions to the problem and on the side of vulnerability. Just in big strokes, I'm going to have to move too quickly through these, but just showing the things that you all know very well, that North America, Europe are the most responsible for climate change historically. And we should look at historical cumulative emissions because they stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years and they're still warming the atmosphere. What we the benefits that we received from our industrialization and building out our infrastructure. And then here's per capita. We in North America are way above global averages. This is a really interesting analysis from Oxfam showing that within countries, there's massive inequality in terms of who's responsible for global warming. To me, these are some of the core elements of climate justice. Here we have the richest 10% of people and the richest 1% being responsible for about 52% of emissions, of the share of cumulative emissions, and the share of the global carbon budget, 31%. So 3 times or 5 times their share, really, of if we were to fairly divide up the global carbon budget. And this is just one other way of looking at the inequality within countries. Here in the US, we're about 17 tons of carbon dioxide per capita average, but that average hides a massive disparity from about 8 tons, which is closer to the world average, up to 50 among the top 10%, and if you did the top 1%. In my book with Brad Parks a long time ago called Climate of Injustice, we did a calculation that one rich American emits as much as a football stadium, 100,000 people in Sudan, for example. So now turning to the negotiations, is it addressing these issues of climate justice? And I'm saying it's 30 years. Well, no, actually it's 50 years, because if we go back to Stockholm in 1972, right from the beginning, there was acknowledgement of unequal causes of global problems. Brazil had that lovely quote where they said, it's a happy coincidence that the countries that cause the problems also have the resources to solve them, which was a clever way of saying, if you want us to address global environmental issues, climate change wasn't even on the agenda at that point. But if you want us to address these global issues, you're going to have to pay us, because we need to do things like take care of our people and develop beyond a basic level. And so if you want us to do this stuff, you need to create new and additional climate finance. So the language of new and additional funding, it was called the Earth Increment back in those days. That is increment above foreign assistance or foreign aid, or ODA. And they called it the Environment Fund. And in the Rio Earth Summit, we had similar language. Of course, the core language was that countries would act according to their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and according to the principles of equity, which I would argue has never happened. There's been promises, including funding in Rio. There was more language about new and additional climate finance. This is, of course, where the original UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was, problematic in many ways, but it did at least agree some binding targets on the wealthiest countries to reduce their emissions. And then there was this thing, the Clean Development Mechanism created, which included sort of shifting funding from the wealthy countries to the poor countries by having us buy their cheap emissions reductions. And And some interviews we did and some other writings have said that the reasons why poor countries even agreed to the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed largely in green rooms or these sort of back rooms, was because it had climate finance. It was supposed to be replaced in Copenhagen in 2009, this Kyoto, second phase, but really that floundered. But there was agreed a $100 billion pledge by 2020 and a green climate fund. Apparently the idea was from Hillary Clinton here with Barack Obama and the leaders of BASIC group, the 4 wealthy countries of Brazil, China, India, and South Africa. They agreed to $100 billion a year. The head of the G77 at the time was Stanislaw Dioping, who said it's not enough to buy coffins for everyone who will die because of climate change in Africa, because at that time, reports were showing that Africa was going to be warming much faster than other parts of the world. Paris, of course, cemented that $100 billion was continued through 2025. That's the 3-minute warning. I noticed that. I think I'm actually 4 minutes. But so in the Paris pledges, they're called the nationally determined contributions. We have $3.5 trillion in needs that were identified by developing countries for climate finance. So I'm just leaving these questions out there because I'm down to 3 minutes. What does climate finance mean? I think it has some potential to represent an opening for developing countries, but many of the patterns suggest that it's still following old inequalities in foreign aid and so on. And we can see that not a lot of the money is actually flowing to the lowest income countries. That's who's receiving the finance. The mechanisms of climate finance are still convoluted. This is called the spaghetti diagram usually. And it means that really it's very poorly governed, that it's flowing through a fragmented system, a non-system of hundreds of channels. And then there's quite a bit of dispute about how much really should be counted. Here's the latest numbers. I got to update this, but this is from Oxfam re-review, where the OECD, the wealthy countries, say they're delivering about 60 or 70 or 80 billion. They admitted that they did not meet the target. But if you look more closely at each project, and we've done this a long time, you'll find that the numbers of actual climate-specific assistance is far lower, and only a tiny amount actually goes to adaptation to climate change. I'll skip that. So after all these decades of negotiations, I sort of sum it up that climate finance is actually only protecting global capitalism in the face of climate injustice, that we have not really addressed the injustice of climate change. Climate finance is funding that we promise and often very poorly act on in terms of delivery. So solutions, I'm down to 1.5 minutes, would be adequate, reliable, additional climate finance support, sources. And so I think we need innovative finance raised internationally. I'll come back to that slide. So we did an analysis, how will we pay for loss and damage? And we went through financial transaction taxes, passenger levies, solidarity levies, bunker fuels. These things have never been taxed before, and they provide an opportunity for raising funding outside of national treasuries. There's issues of transparency that I've been beating the drum on for many years, that we need clear reporting and tracking in real time of climate finance, from the fundraising to the spending. We need accountability. And then my last 45 seconds, I'm going to talk about this. We need to attend to the resistance. That is, we need to fight really against those who would delay action on climate change. So we have had 30 years of great intentions of people believing that more science and good policy and good technology will make it inevitable that people will believe in climate change and act adequately and build the political institutions that they need to. But in fact, there's been an organized and well-funded opposition. This is from a primer from the Climate Social Science Network, CSSN, called The Structure of Obstruction, that shows this complex web of organizations that corporations and their conservative foundations and individuals are using to drive basically inaction on climate change and delay. So my theory of change is that we need to identify and delegitimize these vested interests that are just trying to protect largely fossil fuels and a series of their partner organizations. It's much more complex than just that. And reveal that they are not actually advancing the public interests, but rather their private interests. So thank you very much, Julia.
So the title of the next talk is Pivoting Between Politics of Loss and Science of Hope in Governing a Just Future for Humanity. With the speaker, I'm very excited to introduce Professor Emily Boyd from Lund University. Emily is director of Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies and professor in sustainability science. She is a leading social scientist with a background in international development, environment, and climate change, with focus on the interdisciplinary nexus of poverty, livelihoods, and resilience in relation to global environmental change. Emily is currently leading work on undesirable resilience, politics of loss and damage, and intersectionality and societal transitions. So we're really looking forward to this talk, and I think it'll follow in very nicely from Timmons. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you so much, Emily, and hi, Timmons. Great to see you, and lovely to meet everyone else online. So I'm going to try and get through this talk in the time that I have. Just starting with what I'm going to talk about, which is coming from the work that we're doing here at Lund University around loss and damage, as Timmons mentioned earlier, but also connecting it in with ideas about hope. And just to preface that as well, that not to fall into kind of a naivety that Timmons highlighted earlier, with that everything's going to be solved if we just turn towards, for example, the youth movement as a solution, but to think about what climate justice means in a broader context, and how thinking about hope, which scholars like John Barnett have been advocating, linking that into the work we're doing on loss. So as you know, climate justice is experiencing some kind of a renaissance in the context of a sort of large-scale loss and damage, both economic and non-economic. And we also see growing vulnerability among people across all corners of the planet. And I guess we're very much at the place now that globally societies are confronted with climate change in many different ways. And that is compounded, importantly, by existing social vulnerabilities and multiple crises. And I think Timmons also made that point earlier, that when we're thinking about climate loss, it's not just about climate change and climate impacts, it's about understanding the underpinning roots of vulnerability and the societal dimensions of how we govern the planet that connect then into how we understand the role of climate change and its effects. So the challenge in my talk here is about how we define and navigate towards a safe and just future for people on the planet. And this is inspired to some extent by the work that's been done by Rockström and colleagues, which is published in this work on Earth's Future, where they set out this beautiful schematic here, where you can see the very near past. We've come through the Holocene, and now you can see where we're at this sort of tipping point in the present here and now, where we have the possibility to either pivot into a very unsafe future, which is the very pink sort of basin example there, or we can go towards a safe and just future, which is exemplified by the green. So when we think about a figure like this, we're thinking about how risks are projected into the future. And at the same time, there's no question that either which direction we go, the loss and damage is a very complex arena. And it has much to do with who is responsible and who pays for creating the safe and fair future under climate change. So we need to somehow navigate to some kind of safe future. I think we'd all agree on that, but how and what does that look like? So in general, when we think about losses, we are thinking about it in relation to critically about limits to adaptation and the results in cost to societies, both in terms of the the financial cost, lost dollars, as Timmons exemplified earlier, but also in terms of the negative consequences for cultures, from territories, cultural heritage of loss, for example, such as rising from sea level rise. But by no means is it easy to define, measure, or govern these limits. And also, as the talk hopefully will demonstrate here, we also see that climate justice is also imbued with hope. So going towards that just climate future. And researchers are demonstrating increasingly a resurgence of ideals on the redistribution of resources, as also Timmons highlighted, fair procedures and recognition of rights as mechanisms for inclusion and accountability. So maybe that relates to the question earlier on about what kind of mechanisms are we looking at. So this is a temporal framework that we're working with to try and weave in climate justice from the past, present, and the future to go towards some kind of a just future. And within that, there are clear elements that we need to explore, such as geographies of loss, scale, revisiting scale, and also understanding better powers and values. So in terms of key concepts that we encounter when we're trying to connect ideas of hope through new, if not complex ideas on things like compensation, degrowth, addressing vulnerability as an opportunity for agency. In evidence of this, we see emerging concepts around infrastructures of hope, ideas of solidarity or solidarity funds, but also evidence of collective action around mobilization among civil society and youth that we've seen emerging in recent years. In parallel with emergence of climate science, or for example, the climate science of attribution, for all its flaws, it's at least pivoted us into an arena of discussion about the role of science in relation to social mobilization that's important and interesting. But we also see numerous court cases and emergence of climate litigation. And whilst climate litigation per se will not necessarily lead to the kind of just transformations that we hope for towards that just future, it's part of that process of creating energy and agency towards potential changes in laws in general. So climate change is no longer an abstract idea for some, but very much a growing reality for many. So in this regard, communities and leaders are and will mobilize over many coming years ahead. So if we then turn to think about sort of the three key dimensions of this framework that we're exploring with the geographies of loss, what we know now is that we can see that there's very much a clear set of losses, but both in the global north and the global south, as seen in the most recent IPCC report, that there are adaptation limits encountered across places and spaces. We see increased frequency and intensity of many kind of climate-related events in the United States, Australia, Sweden, Europe in general, but obviously, of course, across many parts of the global south, and raising questions increasingly about what is development today and who is vulnerable, and what are those people at the front line of geographies of loss experiencing. The politics of scale, although nothing new per se, we're revisiting that in the context of loss to try and understand, who wins and who loses at different scales, but also how the ideas that are forming around, for example, loss and damage as an object of climate justice, how that is formed, how the actors interact in different places at different sites to create these new norms and new values. And you can see from this picture here of this person, it's a sculpture of a person pushing this big silver ball here. It's a matter of perspective sometimes. Sometimes you see yourself as a very small individual, and sometimes you see yourself as part of a much bigger landscape. And I think that definitely our discussions around scale are not over by far, and it's embarking on new conversations around scale. The third element there is values, and that's relating to the way we're thinking about the way we different thoughts on losses and damages with regard to how we define it in terms of monetary scales, or whether we talk about it in terms of non-economic losses and damage, and the aspects that are difficult to measure and that are related to the intangible are often left out of the equation, as seen in this quote here in a recent paper by Jackson. So it often leads to inaccurate representations of and debates about how people and societies actually experience losses and damages. And that leads us into the need for some kind of subjective understandings of the values around losses and damages. Very instrumental to helping advance our understanding in this regard, we can take from the IPBES and turn to their understandings about how we connect worldviews more broadly with broad values and guiding principles in society, and also that down to the kinds of scientific natures, values of nature and the indicators thereof. So there's a lot of interesting work that is going on around living from and within and in nature that can help to inform us within our work on loss and damage. So when it comes to the temporal dimensions, there is an important element of how we connect past collective memories into the present and how we express those into the future. And this is where the notion of hope comes in some sense. First off is the connection between the past and the present, to be connecting in historical injustices, and the fact that if we take into account the past, present, and then into the future, there is a risk that we might normalize loss as a kind of dead end, as we see, for example, in the case of the Torres Strait Islanders. They're very much mobilizing agency towards this idea that people may want to remain immobile, and they have a right to stay. So therefore comes in the notion that there is a level of hope, also connected to the work of John Barnett. What happens if we look forward into future trajectories of vulnerability? If we're going towards this just and safe future, but we lack imagination for what that might look like, or taking into account the agency and the desire and the direction of some communities that maybe remain more marginal, then we risk again at normalizing a particular kind of trajectory into the future and following that. That may influence the kinds of efforts that we engage with in facilitating adaptation to climate change. One example of that is the way that we see in the IPCC that we have mapped out and look at present day distribution of refugee camps, for example, in the future. And you can see this very dire picture here of what the most vulnerable displaced communities are going to experience under changing climate. But one could argue in this sort of hope framework, connecting to loss, is that we can choose to direct towards that future or not, depending on the decisions and the mechanisms that we implement today. And then finally, pivoting into the notion of hope or gain of voice as part of this trajectory that societies can choose to engage with. We have seen this emergence of a number of social actors, new social actors among youth groups that are raising this intergenerational perspective with amazingly informed, amazingly active, and aware young people who are really teaching many of us about ways that we might think about contestation and collaboration and the potential for actually creating just transformations through changing law and legal systems more broadly, but through mobilizing through litigation. So I think I'm running out of time now, but this is just pictures here of the Aurora court case. That is one of the first court cases to be put forward by a group of youth in Sweden, and they are currently suing the Swedish state for unfairly and in terms of human rights, not protecting future generations in terms of the actions that the Swedish state is taking. And those youth groups are also garnering support from different other sectors in society who are part of creating a new narrative around responsibility and who pays. So on that note, just to summarize, in my very short, brief intervention here, that there are 3 points. One is that climate justice is part of this corridor to a safe and just planet. The question of how to is, I guess, what we're all interested here, and how we enter into this, whether it be through the loss and damage space or whether it be through degrowth or other means. There's an opportunity to link between politics of loss and the science of hope. And we see that there are many actions that are coming to the fore globally between loss and hope. And on that note, I'll finish. Thank you.